Hi everybody, today we are going to learn how to graph with a table. Okay, so before we start learning how to complete a table and how to graph, we do need to do a quick review of something really important, order of operations, because today we are going to be simplifying expressions that have more than one operation. So we have to know what order to do that in. So many of you have heard of the phrase PEMDAS. This is our order of operations phrase to help us remember which one comes first, which one comes next. So the way, or what PEMDAS means is parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, or subtract. So this is the order that we complete our operations. So parentheses means anything that is inside your parentheses. Exponents are something like 2 squared or 2 cubed. We won't see those today, but here's the ones that we will see today. So it's really important that we always multiply or divide before we add or subtract. Now, since multiplication and division are inverse operations, these two are actually interchangeable. It doesn't matter if we divide or multiply first. Same for adding and subtracting. Since they are inverse operations, the order doesn't quite matter. However, it is extremely important that when we simplify, we are multiplying or dividing before we add or subtract, or else we're going to get a completely different value. So let's do a quick review of this with some substitutions. So let's consider this expression, 2x minus 3. So notice we have two operations. We have multiplication with 2 times x, and then we have subtraction. So we are going to need to follow our order of operations. So first what we're going to do is we're going to substitute the following x values and then simplify. And remember, substitute just means to replace something with something that it's equal to. So in this case, for part A, we're going to replace x with 1. So here's how I'd like you to show substitution. We're going to first take out the variable from our original expression. So notice I just simply removed the x and I replaced it with open parentheses. Whenever we substitute, I would like you to use parentheses to do so. And then we're going to substitute it with the value that x is equal to, so 1. Now we have to do our order of operations. So remember, we always multiply before we add or subtract. So we have to do 2 times 1, which is 2, and then we can subtract. 2 minus 3 is negative 1. All right, let's try again. So first, let's take out our variable, and then we're going to substitute x with 3. So now we can do order of operations. Multiply, 2 times 3 is 6. 6 minus 3 is 3. And let's try it one more time, except this time we are going to substitute x with negative 2. Now remember, when you're multiplying with a negative, the product is always going to be negative. If you multiply with one negative, you get a negative. So we have negative 4 minus 3. You'll notice here that we have two numbers that have the same sign. So we're going to add up the values. 4 plus 3 is 7, but we started with more negatives, so our answer is negative. So here is our quick review of order of operations and substitution. Okay, go ahead and pause the video, and I'd like you to try these 3 substitutions. Notice that we are using a different expression now. We're using 3 times x plus 1. So pause the video and give these a try. All right, let's go ahead and check our work. So here you can see my 3 substitutions, x equals 2, x equals negative 1, and x equals 0. Here we end up with 6 plus 1, which is 7. Here we end up with negative 3 plus 1, which is negative 2. And last, we end up with 0 plus 1, which is 1. All right, so now we're going to talk about how to graph what are called functions with tables. So yesterday we learned how to plot XY coordinates, and that ties in really nicely to today's lesson, because we're going to be graphing what are called functions. So functions are equations that have an x and a y. So that's where the x and the y values of our coordinates are going to come from. So a function is essentially just a number machine. So we're going to pick an input The x values are what we call inputs. We are going to select these values and substitute them into our equation or our function. And that will give us a y value, which is our output. So those y values, the outputs are going to go into our coordinates along with the x values, and then we're going to plot them, like we learned yesterday, on an xy axis. After we plot the coordinates, we're going to connect the dots, and we should end up with a nice line. So I'm going to show you guys what the table, how I'd like you to set up the table for these, but the process is going to be the same every time. We pick some x values and we substitute them. We see what we get, and then we plot our points. Okay, so here's an example of what I would like your table to look like. So we are going to have a column for x, a column for our equation or function. In this case, our function is y equals x plus 1. So this is the machine that our number is going to go through. And then what we get is our y value, or our output. Then we take the x and the y and we put it together as a coordinate, and then we're going to graph it after. So when you are graphing these functions, you can actually pick whichever x values you want. It's usually a good idea to pick a negative. I will always pick 0, and then I'll pick some positive. So let's pick -3, 0, and +1. Okay, and you can pick whichever x values you want. So these are the x values that I'm going to substitute into our function. So remember, we always substitute with parentheses. In fact, we can set up our substitution for all three. We can take out our x value and replace it with our new value that we chose. So -3, 0, and 1. And then all we need to do is simplify. Well, -3 plus 1 is -2, so that's our output. Our input was -3, and once it goes through the function, we get -2. Let's try this one. When our input is 0, we get 0 plus 1, which is 1. And when our input is 1, we get 1 plus 1, which is 2. So our coordinates are going to be -3, -2, 0, 1, and 1, 2. So we're just combining our input and our output into an xy coordinate. Now I'm going to graph these values on our xy axis. So once again, these are the three values we're going to, or the three coordinates we're going to plot. So we have -3, -2. So we go left 3, down 2. 0, 1. So we don't move left or right, but we move up 1. And then we have 1, 2. So right 1, up 2. And now we connect our dots. So you'll notice that when we connect our dots, we get a perfectly straight line. Or it would be straight maybe if I used a ruler. However, you should have the same thing. And for all of the functions that we're going to be graphing, at least right now, they're all going to be what are called linear functions. So they should all make straight lines. So if you start to plot your points and you notice that they don't make a perfectly straight line, that's how you know that something is wrong and you need to go back and check your work. Okay, let's try another one together. This time, the function that we're working with is -x minus 2. I want to remind you that -x just means -1 times x. So you'll see that we actually have two operations here, multiplication and subtraction. So let's pick some x values. Let's pick -1, 0, and 3. So I picked a negative value, 0 is always a good one, and then a positive value. So let's set up our substitution. Here we have negative, and then we blank minus 2, negative blank minus 2, and then negative blank minus 2. And now we can substitute the values. So we have -1, 0, and 3. So you can see that we just substituted our x values for x. All right, so now we need to simplify. And this is when we're going to need to use order of operations. So we know that we always multiply before we add or subtract. So let's do this one first. -1 times -1 is +1. And then 1 minus 2 is -1. So we're going to do this in 2 steps. Now here, -1 times 0 is 0. And then 0 minus 2 is -2. And lastly, -1 times 3 is -3. and negative 3 minus 2 is negative 5. So our coordinates are going to be negative 1, 0, negative 2, and 3, negative 5. So we're going to plot those coordinates over here on the right. Negative 1 is right here. 0, negative 2 is right here. And 3, negative 5 is down here. And you could see that when we connect these dots, they do in fact make a nice straight line. Please also make sure to add little arrows on the ends of your line. This shows that if our graph was big enough, it would just continue going in the same direction in that straight line. So we are always going to add those little arrows onto our graph. Okay. Let's try one more example together. So here you'll see again that we have two separate operations. Our function is 1/2 times x, so we have multiplication, and then minus 2. Now, I did say that we can pick whichever x values you want, and this is still the case. However, when you have a fraction in your equation or function, there's always going to be a few choices that are much easier to work with. So the general rule is you're going to look at the denominator of your fraction, which in this case is 2, and that should be the x value that you pick. Those are going to be much, much easier to simplify. So since I see a 2 down here, let's pick negative 2 and then positive 2, and then 0 we'll always pick because it's really the easiest to work with. So now we can do our substitution. So I'm going to take out x, and then I'm going to substitute the values we picked. So we picked negative 2, 0, and positive 2. Now I want to remind you that when you're multiplying to a fraction, you multiply to the numerator and then you just divide by the denominator. And you could do this in whatever order you want. So if I do negative 2 times 1, I get negative 2. And negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. So this simplifies to negative 1. We could also go back, we could divide first. I can do negative 2 divided by 2, which is negative 1. Negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. And then here we have negative 1 minus 2, which is negative 3. Okay, so let's try this next one. 1/2 times 0 is just 0, and 0 minus 2 is negative 2. And then last, 2 times 1 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And 1 minus 2 is negative 1. So my coordinates are negative 2, negative 3, 0, negative 2, and 2, negative 1. So we can plot our coordinates on our xy axis. So we have negative 2, negative 3, 0, negative 2, and 2, negative 1. And we see that we end up with a nice straight line, which means that our answer is correct. All right, so I'm going to have you try to graph y equals 2x plus 1 on your own. So go ahead and pause the video. If you want to use the same x values as me, let's do negative 3, 0, and positive 1, so we can have the same x values. However, if you want to pick different x values, go for it. Your graph should still end up looking the same. Okay, let's go ahead and check. Like I said, you might have picked different x values, but if you picked these x values, you should get these exact y values. So we got negative 3, negative 5, 0, 1, and 1, 3. Remember here you need to multiply first to get negative 6 and then add. Negative 6 plus 1 is 5. So then if you plot those coordinates, you should get a graph that looks something like this. If you had different coordinates, you should still have a graph that looks the same. You just might have different coordinates plotted, but you should end up with a graph that looks exactly the same. All right, that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching.